The homecoming. Corporal Elijah Thompson stepped off the plane with a deep breath, the sharp scent of jet fuel, and the muffled hum of airport life filling his senses. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, a small yet significant reminder of the 6 grueling months he had spent deployed overseas. The flight back home had been long, but the thought of seeing his family and finally being able to unwind made the journey bearable. The airport was bustling, with people rushing in every direction. Some were eager to catch flights, others were embracing loved ones in tearful reunions. Elijah's heart swelled at the thought of his own reunion. He imagined the smiles of his 2 young daughters, the warm embrace of his wife, and the laughter that had been absent during his months away. Making his way to the security checkpoint, Elijah fell into line like everyone else. He wasn't in uniform, but his military haircut and the tags around his neck hinted at his service. He smiled at the elderly woman ahead of him, who struggled with her carry-on bag. Stepping forward, he helped her place it onto the conveyor belt. "Thank you, young man," she said with a kind smile. Elijah nodded politely. "No problem, ma'am." As he approached the metal detector, he went through the routine motions. Shoes off, belt off, empty pockets. It was second nature by now, a process he'd done countless times before. He placed his duffel bag on the conveyor belt and waited for his turn. The beep of the metal detector signaled him forward. He walked through, expecting nothing more than a brief moment of inconvenience. But before he could retrieve his bag, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You, step aside." Elijah froze for a moment, unsure if the command was directed at him. He turned to see a security officer pointing in his direction. The man, mid-40s with a stern expression, wore the standard blue uniform of airport security, but carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Elijah stepped aside, his brow furrowed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly. The officer, whose name had read Harris, looked him up and down with a scrutinizing gaze. "Random check," he said curtly, gesturing for Elijah to follow him. Elijah complied without question. He had nothing to hide and figured it was just standard protocol. Still, something about Harris's demeanor felt off. It wasn't the usual indifferent professionalism Elijah was used to from security personnel. There was something sharper, something hostile. Harris led him to a secondary screening area and gestured for him to place his hands out. "What's in the bag?" Harris asked, his tone accusatory rather than inquisitive. "Just my clothes and personal belongings," Elijah replied. "I just returned from deployment overseas." Harris narrowed his eyes. "A soldier, huh?" he said, almost mockingly. "And where exactly were you deployed?" Elijah hesitated. "Afghanistan." Harris snorted. "Convenient," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Elijah to hear. The remark stung, but Elijah said nothing. He was no stranger to prejudice, and he knew better than to react impulsively. Instead, he stood still, his military training kicking in, urging him to remain calm. But Harris wasn't finished. He rifled through Elijah's bag with an unnecessary roughness, scattering its contents across the table. A pair of socks landed on the floor, and Harris made no move to pick them up. "What exactly are you looking for?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Whatever I need to find," Harris shot back. "You people always think you can get away with anything." The words hit Elijah like a slap. "You people." The phrase carried a weight he had encountered far too many times in his life. It was a label, a dismissal, a dehumanization. "I don't know what you mean by you people," Elijah said, his tone measured. "But I've done nothing wrong." Harris ignored him and continued searching, his actions growing more aggressive. Passengers nearby began to notice the commotion, their curious gazes adding to Elijah's discomfort. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment, their silent questions. Finally, Harris stepped back, his expression smug. "Empty your pockets." Elijah sighed and complied, placing his wallet, keys, and phone on the table. Harris inspected them, as though expecting to find something incriminating. When he found nothing, his frustration was palpable. "Is this going to take much longer?" Elijah asked, his patience wearing thin. "I have a family waiting for me." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me, soldier," he said, stepping closer. "I'll decide how long this takes." Elijah clenched his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay calm. He glanced around, hoping for someone to intervene, but the other officers stood at a distance, their faces blank. They weren't going to help. The tension reached its breaking point when Harris suddenly shoved Elijah against the table, his grip firm and unyielding. The move was so unexpected, so unnecessary, that Elijah was momentarily stunned. "What are you doing?" Elijah demanded, his voice rising. "This is harassment. You think you can talk to me like that?" Harris snapped, his face inches from Elijah's. "I don't care where you've been or what you've done. You don't belong here." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. The humiliation, the anger, the disbelief. It was all too much. He wanted to fight back, to push Harris away, but he knew that any resistance would only make things worse. In the midst of the chaos, a voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "Officer Harris, what's going on here?" Both men turned to see a senior officer approaching, her expression stern. Her presence brought a flicker of hope to Elijah's heart. Perhaps someone would finally put an end to this madness. But as Officer Park surveyed the scene, her eyes lingered on Elijah. Instead of addressing the obvious misconduct, her face remained cold and detached. "This man was being uncooperative," Harris said quickly, his tone defensive. "I was just following protocol." Park nodded slowly, her gaze shifting between Harris and Elijah. "Understood," she said flatly. "Corporal Thompson, you'll need to come with me." Elijah stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. "You can't be serious," he said. "I've done nothing wrong." But Park's expression didn't waver. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Elijah's shoulders sagged. The fight, it seemed, was far from over. As he followed Officer Park, he couldn't help but wonder, how could this happen? How could a country he had sacrificed so much for treat him like this? This was supposed to be a homecoming, a moment of peace and joy. Instead, it had become a battleground, one where the enemy wasn't foreign, but the very people sworn to protect and serve. And as Elijah walked through the airport, surrounded by silence and judgment, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, a fight for dignity, for justice, and for the right to simply exist. A test of resolve. Corporal Elijah Thompson followed Officer Park through the airport's long, sterile corridors. The clicking of her boots against the tiled floor echoed around them, each step a reminder of the path he was being forced to walk. The humiliation of being singled out and harassed weighed heavily on him, but beneath that, a growing resolve began to take root. He would not let this moment define him. They arrived at a small, windowless office tucked away in a quiet corner of the airport. The room was sparse, containing only a table, a few chairs, and a security camera mounted in the corner. Park motioned for Elijah to sit, her expression unreadable. He complied, lowering himself into the chair, his posture rigid and his fists clenched on the table. "Corporal Thompson," Park began, her tone measured but devoid of empathy, "we're conducting an investigation into a potential security concern. Your cooperation is expected." Elijah raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Security concern? I've done nothing but comply with every instruction given to me. I'm a soldier returning home from deployment. Why am I being treated like a criminal?" Park's gaze didn't falter, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "This is standard protocol. Officer Harris flagged your behavior as suspicious." "Suspicious," Elijah repeated, his voice tinged with frustration. "The only thing suspicious here is why I was singled out in the first place." Park didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened a folder she had brought in, flipping through a few papers. Elijah watched her carefully, searching for any sign of understanding or fairness. Instead, her next words were as cold and calculated as before. "Corporal, while we respect your service, your conduct today has raised questions." Officer Harris reported non-compliance during the screening process. Elijah's hands gripped the edge of the table. "Non-compliance? Are you serious? I followed every instruction, even when he shoved me against the table and humiliated me in front of everyone." Park didn't flinch at his raised tone. "I wasn't there to witness the exchange, but Officer Harris' report indicates that you were confrontational." Elijah leaned forward, his frustration boiling over. "Confrontational? Let me be clear. I didn't raise my voice, didn't resist, and didn't do anything to provoke him. This isn't about protocol. It's about prejudice. And you know it." Park met his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Elijah thought he saw a glimmer of doubt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'm here to assess the situation, Corporal, not to make judgments about character." Elijah sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. He had faced down enemy fire, endured grueling missions, and survived months of separation from his family. But this quiet, insidious attack on his dignity felt like a battle he hadn't prepared for. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter, but no less resolute. Park closed the folder and folded her hands on the table. "You'll remain here while we complete our investigation. If we determine that there's no further risk, you'll be allowed to leave." Elijah couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Risk? The only risk here is the unchecked power of a man who decided to target me for no reason." Park didn't respond. Instead, she rose from her seat and headed for the door. "Someone will be in shortly," she said before exiting, leaving Elijah alone in the room. The minutes dragged on like hours. The oppressive silence of the small office seemed to close in on Elijah, amplifying every thought racing through his mind. He replayed the events in his head, searching for some logic, some explanation for why this was happening. But the truth was clear. Officer Harris had seen his skin color, his military tags, and decided he didn't belong. Elijah's thoughts turned to his daughters, Ava and Leela. They were 8 and 5, both too young to fully understand the complexities of the world, but old enough to ask questions. He had always tried to shield them from the harsher realities of life, to show them that hard work and integrity could overcome anything. But now he wondered how he would explain this to them. The door opened, interrupting his thoughts. Officer Harris entered, his face twisted into a smug expression that made Elijah's stomach churn. Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed, radiating an air of self-satisfaction. "Comfortable, soldier?" Harris sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. Elijah didn't respond. He refused to give Harris the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. "You know," Harris continued, stepping closer, "people like you think you're untouchable just because you wear that uniform. But not here. Not on my watch." Elijah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "I've served this country with honor," he said evenly. "I've earned the right to be treated with respect." Harris laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Respect. Respect is earned, and from where I'm standing, you're nothing but trouble." Elijah stood, unable to sit any longer under the weight of Harris's words. He towered over the officer, his presence commanding but restrained. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You don't know what I've sacrificed or what I've endured. And yet you've decided that I'm a threat because of the way I look. That's not just wrong. It's cowardly." Harris's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he stepped closer, his chest nearly touching Elijah's. "Careful, soldier. You're on thin ice." Elijah stared him down, unflinching. "The only thin ice here is the one you're standing on. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Harris opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the door opened again. Officer Park stepped in, followed by a man in a crisp black suit. The man's presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. He exuded authority, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with a practiced gaze. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. Harris stepped back, suddenly looking uneasy. "Just conducting protocol, Mr. Daniels." Daniels, clearly someone of higher authority, didn't seem convinced. He turned to Elijah, his expression neutral. "Corporal Thompson, my name is Daniel Edwards. I'm the airport's security director. I've been briefed on the situation and reviewed the initial reports." Elijah met his gaze, sensing a shift in the air. "And what's your assessment, sir?" Edwards glanced at Harris, then back at Elijah. "I think there's been a grave mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Harris's face turned red, and he sputtered, "But sir, this man—" "Enough," Edwards interrupted, his tone sharp. "I've reviewed the footage from the security cameras, and I see no justification for your actions, Officer Harris." Corporal Thompson complied with every instruction and was subjected to treatment that was not only unprofessional but discriminatory. Harris's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Edwards turned to Elijah, his expression softening slightly. "Corporal Thompson, on behalf of the airport, I apologize for the way you've been treated. This is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed." Elijah nodded, his chest still tight with residual anger. "I appreciate that, but an apology isn't enough. This kind of behavior can't continue. Not for me, not for anyone." Edwards' jaw tightened. "You're absolutely right. Rest assured, there will be consequences." As Harris began to protest, Edwards silenced him with a glare. "Officer Harris, effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Please turn in your badge and leave the premises." Elijah watched as Harris's face turned from red to pale. The smugness evaporated, replaced by shock and indignation. "You can't be serious," he stammered. "I am," Edwards said firmly. "Now leave." Harris stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Edwards turned back to him. "I'll personally ensure this incident is thoroughly reviewed, and I'll provide you with updates," Edwards said. "In the meantime, if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Elijah nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Thank you, but what I need is change. Real change." Edwards met his gaze and nodded. "I understand, and I'll do everything in my power to make that happen." As Elijah left the office, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter, but the fire in his heart burned brighter. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a fight he hadn't asked for, but was determined to see through. The ripple effect. Elijah Thompson exited the airport, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The fresh air outside did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. He had won a small battle. Harris was suspended, and the security director had acknowledged the wrongdoing. But the victory felt hollow. The humiliation and degradation he had endured lingered like a bitter taste. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness, one that wouldn't be cured with a single apology or suspension. He slid into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Glancing at the screen, he saw his wife's name. Taking a deep breath, he answered. "Elijah." Her voice was filled with relief and excitement. "Are you on your way home? The girls can't wait to see you." He hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "Yeah, I'm heading out now," he said, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "I'll be home soon." "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone shifting to concern. Elijah swallowed hard. "Yeah, just a long day." She didn't press further, sensing his reluctance to talk. "All right, drive safe. We'll see you soon. Love you." "Love you too," he replied, ending the call. He stared at the phone for a moment before setting it down. He wanted to be present for his family, to walk through the door with a genuine smile and open arms, But the events of the day weighed on him. He needed to do something, anything, to make sense of what had happened. The first step. By the time Elijah reached home, his daughters were waiting on the porch, their faces lighting up as his car pulled into the driveway. They ran to him as he stepped out, their small arms wrapping around his waist. "Daddy!" Ava, his oldest, exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. "Welcome home, Daddy," Leela added, her words slightly muffled against his shirt. For a moment, the world felt right. Elijah knelt, hugging them tightly, drawing strength from their innocent warmth. His wife, Natalie, stood by the door, smiling softly, but watching him closely. She knew him well enough to sense when something was wrong. Dinner that night was lively, filled with laughter and stories from the girls about school and their friends. Elijah listened, nodding and smiling, but his mind remained clouded. Natalie noticed his distraction and waited until the girls were asleep before addressing it. As they sat on the couch, she placed a hand on his. "All right, Elijah. What's going on?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated." "Try me," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Elijah recounted the events at the airport, from the moment Harris singled him out to the final confrontation in the security office. He didn't spare any details, his voice steady but laced with anger and frustration. Natalie listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to outrage. "That's unacceptable," she said when he finished. "You've given so much to this country, and this is how they treat you." Elijah nodded. "It's not just me. This happens to people every day, people who don't have the same platform or resources to fight back." Natalie squeezed his hand. "Then we need to do something about it." Her words struck a chord. Elijah had been so focused on his own experience that he hadn't considered the broader implications. He wasn't the first to face this kind of injustice, and he wouldn't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, he could help make sure fewer people had to endure it. Speaking out. The next morning, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him and his laptop open. Natalie leaned over his shoulder as he typed, her presence a steadying force. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he had to share his story. He drafted a post for social media, choosing his words carefully. He wanted to convey the pain and frustration he felt while also highlighting the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur. "Yesterday, I returned home from deployment, ready to reunite with my family after 6 months overseas. Instead of a warm welcome, I was met with hostility and prejudice at the airport. A security officer targeted me without cause, humiliated me, and treated me as if my service and sacrifice meant nothing. This isn't just my story. It's a reflection of a larger issue that so many face daily. It's time for change, and I'm committed to being a part of it." He hesitated before hitting post, unsure of what kind of response it would receive. Natalie placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do it," she said. "People need to hear this." With a deep breath, Elijah clicked the button. The post was live. The wave begins. By midday, Elijah's post had gone viral. Shares, comments, and messages flooded in, ranging from words of support to stories from others who had experienced similar injustices. His phone buzzed nonstop, and Natalie helped him sort through the responses, both of them overwhelmed by the sheer volume. Among the messages were inquiries from local news stations and journalists, all wanting to hear his story. Elijah hesitated, unsure if he wanted to put himself in the spotlight, but Natalie encouraged him. "This isn't just about you," she said. "It's about everyone who's been silenced or ignored. You have a voice, and people are listening." Elijah agreed, scheduling an interview with a respected local reporter. The interview aired that evening, featuring Elijah recounting the events at the airport and emphasizing the need for accountability and systemic change. As the story gained traction, others began sharing their own experiences with discrimination and abuse of power. The narrative shifted from Elijah's personal ordeal to a broader discussion about systemic racism and the failures of institutions meant to protect and serve. Confronting the system. A few days later, Elijah received a call from Daniel Edwards, the airport security director. Edwards sounded weary but determined. "Corporal Thompson, I wanted to update you on the situation," he began. "The investigation into Officer Harris is ongoing, but I've taken steps to ensure incidents like this don't happen again." Elijah listened silently as Edwards outlined new training programs for airport staff, mandatory bias awareness workshops, and plans to implement body cameras for security personnel. "That's a start," Elijah said finally, "but it's not enough. I want to see real accountability." "You will," Edwards promised. "I'm committed to making this right." Elijah wasn't convinced, but he knew he couldn't rely on Edwards or anyone else to lead the charge. If change was going to happen, it would require constant pressure and vigilance. The bigger picture. In the weeks that followed, Elijah became a reluctant yet effective advocate for justice. He spoke at community forums, met with activists, and collaborated with organizations dedicated to combating racial injustice. His military background lent him credibility, and his calm, measured demeanor made him a powerful voice in the fight for change. The incident at the airport had been a turning point, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who had witnessed his story. It served as a stark reminder that the fight for equality and dignity was far from over. Through it all, Elijah remained grounded by his family. Ava and Leela often sat on his lap during Zoom meetings, their laughter a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. Natalie stood by his side, her unwavering support giving him the strength to continue. As Elijah looked back on the day that had changed everything, he realized something important. The battle against injustice was long and arduous, but it was worth fighting. Not just for himself, but for his daughters and for everyone who deserved to live in a world where they were treated with respect and humanity. And Elijah Thompson, a soldier who had fought on battlefields overseas, was now fighting a different kind of war, one that mattered just as much. A call to action. 2 weeks after his story went viral, Elijah Thompson found himself sitting in a room full of people he had never met before, activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens who had reached out to him after hearing about his experience. The room buzzed with energy and determination, a stark contrast to the silence and isolation he had felt in that airport security office. The meeting was held in a local community center, with folding chairs arranged in a circle and a projector screen displaying Elijah's now famous social media post. At the head of the room, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence addressed the group. "Let's get started," she said, clapping her hands together. "For those of you who don't know, my name is Angela Carter, and I'm the director of the Justice Coalition. We're here today because of one man's bravery in standing up to systemic injustice." Angela gestured toward Elijah, and the room broke into applause. Elijah felt a mix of pride and discomfort. He hadn't sought out this role, but now that he was in it, he was determined to make it count. Angela continued, "Elijah's story has resonated with millions of people, but we all know this isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that allows these kinds of abuses to happen every day. So the question is, what do we do about it?" Building a movement. For the next 2 hours, the group brainstormed ideas and shared stories. Some proposed legal reforms, while others focused on community education and outreach. Elijah listened carefully, occasionally sharing his thoughts, but mostly absorbing the collective wisdom in the room. These were people who had been fighting this battle long before he stepped into it, and he respected their experience. One idea that gained traction was the creation of a nationwide advocacy campaign called Dignity First, aimed at addressing systemic racism in security and law enforcement. The campaign would include petitions, public service announcements, and partnerships with organizations already working in the space. Angela turned to Elijah. "We need a face for this movement," she said. "Someone who can speak to people from all walks of life and bring credibility to our cause." "That someone is you," Elijah hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought of his family, of the quiet life he had envisioned after his deployment. But he also thought of the countless people who didn't have the platform or the voice to fight back. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "But only if we make this about more than just my story. This has to be about everyone who's been silenced or ignored." Angela smiled. "That's exactly what we're aiming for." The roadblocks. In the weeks that followed, Elijah threw himself into the work. He spoke at town halls, appeared on national news programs, and even testified before a congressional subcommittee on the need for reforms in airport security and law enforcement. But the road wasn't easy. For every person who supported the movement, there were others who pushed back, accusing him of overreacting or playing the victim. Social media became a battleground, with heated debates erupting under every post about the campaign. One evening, Elijah sat at his dining table, scrolling through the comments on a news article about his testimony. Natalie sat across from him, her eyes filled with concern. "You need to take a break," she said gently. Elijah shook his head. "I can't. Every time I think about stopping, I remember Harris's face, the way he looked at me like I didn't belong. And I think about how many other people are going through the same thing." Natalie reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm proud of you, Elijah. But you can't pour from an empty cup. Let me help. Let others help." Her words resonated, and Elijah realized she was right. He couldn't do this alone. The next day, he reached out to Angela and the coalition, delegating more responsibilities and expanding the team. The turning point. A few months into the campaign, Elijah received an unexpected call from Daniel Edwards, the airport security director. Edwards's voice was calm, but tinged with urgency. "Corporal Thompson," he began, "I wanted to update you on our internal investigation. Officer Harris has been terminated, and we've implemented several changes, including mandatory bias training and an anonymous reporting system for misconduct." Elijah listened carefully. "That's a start," he said. "But what about accountability beyond your airport? What about systemic change?" Edwards hesitated before responding. "I've been following your campaign, and I think there's an opportunity for us to collaborate. We're hosting a national conference for airport security leaders next month, and I'd like you to be the keynote speaker." The offer surprised Elijah. It was a chance to address the people who had the power to enact real change, but it also felt like a heavy responsibility. "I'll do it," he said after a moment, "but only if I can bring the voices of others into the room. This isn't just about me." "Agreed," Edwards said. "I'll make the arrangements." The conference. The day of the conference arrived, and Elijah stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to his suit jacket. The ballroom was packed with security leaders, law enforcement officials, and journalists. Behind him, a large screen displayed the words "Dignity First," a call for accountability. Angela stood beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said. "Just speak from the heart." When Elijah stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He took a moment to survey the audience before beginning. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady. "My name is Corporal Elijah Thompson, and I'm here today because of an experience that changed my life. But this isn't just about me. It's about a system that fails too many people, too often." He recounted his story, not as a tale of personal grievance, but as a lens through which to view a broader issue. He spoke of the need for accountability, transparency, and humanity in every interaction between security personnel and the public. As he concluded, his voice grew stronger. "We can do better. We must do better. Not just for me, but for every person who looks to us for protection and instead finds prejudice. Change starts here with each of you. Let's make sure dignity comes first, every single time." The room erupted into applause, and Elijah felt a swell of hope. For the first time since that day at the airport, he believed that real change was possible. A new chapter. The conference marked a turning point for both the campaign and Elijah's life. Dignity First gained national attention. With endorsements from prominent figures and organizations, policies began to shift, and conversations about systemic racism and accountability reached new heights. For Elijah, the journey was far from over. But as he returned home that evening, greeted by the laughter of his daughters and the warmth of his wife's embrace, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a fighter for justice, a voice for the voiceless, and a man determined to leave the world better than he had found it. And as long as there was work to be done, Elijah Thompson would be there, standing tall and unwavering, ready to fight for what was right. Bridging the divide. Months had passed since the Dignity First campaign had gained national traction. For Corporal Elijah Thompson, life had shifted dramatically. Once, his days were defined by military missions and the quiet sacrifices of service. Now he was a public figure, a voice for justice and reform, and a symbol of resilience. But with recognition came challenges, and Elijah quickly realized that creating change required more than speeches and headlines. It demanded sustained action, strategy, and most importantly, unity. A polarized nation. The national conversation sparked by Elijah's story had taken on a life of its own. Protests, forums, and marches swept across the country, fueled by the collective outrage of countless people who had endured similar injustices. Social media became a battleground of ideas, with hashtags like #DignityFirst and #JusticeForAll trending alongside vitriolic pushback from those resistant to change. Elijah monitored these developments with a heavy heart. While the campaign had inspired hope and mobilized thousands, it had also exposed deep divisions. Critics accused him of exaggerating his experience, dismissing systemic racism as a manufactured issue. Others, including some former military colleagues, reached out privately, expressing discomfort with his decision to publicly challenge authority. One message from a fellow veteran stayed with him. "You're making us look weak, Thompson. Soldiers don't complain. We handle things in silence. What you're doing, it's not the way." The words stung. Elijah respected the values of discipline and quiet strength that the military had instilled in him, but he couldn't ignore the injustice he had faced, or the countless others who faced it daily. He knew he was walking a difficult path, one that required balancing respect for his past with the courage to challenge the present. The unexpected ally. One evening, as Elijah sat in his modest home office surrounded by stacks of campaign materials, his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar name, Captain Henry Caldwell. Curious, Elijah answered. "This is Corporal Thompson." "Corporal," came a gruff yet measured voice. "This is Captain Caldwell, retired. I served 25 years in the Army, stationed at Fort Bragg for most of it. I've been following your story." Elijah straightened in his chair. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your interest." Caldwell hesitated before continuing. "I wasn't sure if I should call. I'll be honest, when I first heard about your campaign, I didn't agree with it. I thought you were undermining the institutions we swore to protect. But after watching your testimony and reading the stories that have come out since, I've realized I was wrong. The system has cracks, and we need people like you to help fix them." Elijah was momentarily speechless. He had grown accustomed to resistance, even from fellow service members, and this unexpected support felt like a lifeline. "Thank you, Captain. That means a lot coming from someone with your experience." Caldwell's voice softened. "I'm not calling just to compliment you. I want to help. I've spent decades training soldiers and working with leadership. If you're willing, I think we can work together to bridge the divide between people like you and the institutions that need reform." Elijah leaned forward, his mind racing. "What do you have in mind?" "Collaborative solutions." A week later, Elijah met Caldwell at a local veterans center. The retired captain was tall and imposing, with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately commanded respect. But as they spoke, Elijah saw a side of Caldwell that was reflective and deeply committed to change. We need to approach this strategically, Caldwell began, spreading a series of documents across the table. The problem isn't just individual racism. It's systemic blind spots. Training is outdated, oversight is weak, and accountability is inconsistent. We can't just point fingers. We have to offer solutions. Elijah nodded, impressed by Caldwell's thoroughness. Together, they brainstormed initiatives that could address these issues, including bias and de-escalation training, a nationwide program designed for security and law enforcement personnel, emphasizing empathy, cultural competence, and nonviolent conflict resolution. Transparency measures, mandatory body cameras for all security officers, with footage reviewed regularly by independent oversight committees. Military mentorship, a program pairing active duty soldiers with young people from underserved communities to foster mutual understanding and trust. Community forums, monthly meetings where citizens could share concerns directly with local security and law enforcement leaders. Caldwell paused, tapping the table for emphasis. If we want people to listen, we need to bring them to the table. That includes critics, skeptics, and even those who've wronged you. It's the only way to create lasting change. Elijah hesitated. The thought of engaging directly with someone like Officer Harris made his stomach churn. But he knew Caldwell was right. True reform required dialogue, no matter how difficult. The meeting. One of the first forums was held in the same city where Elijah's airport ordeal had unfolded. The event drew a diverse crowd, local residents, activists, security personnel, and even a handful of skeptical onlookers. Elijah stood at the front of the room, flanked by Caldwell and Angela Carter. As he began to speak, he scanned the faces in the audience, searching for signs of engagement or resistance. His speech was candid, acknowledging both the pain of his experience and the broader issues it highlighted. "We're not here to shame or blame," he said. "We're here to listen, to learn, and to find a better way forward. This isn't about dividing us. It's about uniting us around a shared commitment to dignity and respect." When the floor opened for questions, a middle-aged man in a security uniform stood. His posture was stiff, his expression guarded. "I'm Officer Jenkins," he began, his voice hesitant. "I've worked in airport security for 15 years. I've never harassed anyone, but I feel like I'm being painted with the same brush as the bad actors. How do we fix that?" Elijah met his gaze. "By working together," he said. "This isn't about blaming you or your colleagues. It's about ensuring that the systems you work within are fair and just for everyone. That benefits both the public and the officers who serve them." Jenkins nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Fair enough." As the forum continued, the conversation grew more productive. Residents shared their fears and frustrations, while officers spoke candidly about the challenges they faced. By the end of the night, the room felt lighter, as if a small but significant barrier had been broken. The personal reckoning. Later that evening, as Elijah packed up his materials, a familiar figure approached. It was Daniel Edwards, the airport security director. Behind him stood Officer Harris, who looked uncomfortable but determined. "Corporal Thompson," Edwards began, his tone formal. "Officer Harris has something he'd like to say." Harris stepped forward, his eyes avoiding Elijah's. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice low. "But I've had time to think about what happened, and I realize I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry for the way I treated you." Elijah studied Harris's face, searching for sincerity. It wasn't easy to let go of the anger and humiliation he still carried, but he knew this moment was about more than him. It was about setting an example for how to move forward. "I accept your apology," Elijah said finally. "But words are just the beginning. What matters is what you do next." Harris nodded, his face a mix of relief and resolve. "I'm willing to do the work." A brighter horizon. As Elijah drove home that night, he reflected on how far the journey had taken him. From a moment of injustice at an airport to the beginnings of systemic reform, The road had been long and difficult, but the progress was real, and for the first time, he felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the countless others who deserved a fairer, kinder world. His daughters were asleep when he walked through the door, their small faces peaceful in the glow of their nightlights. Natalie met him in the hallway, her eyes filled with pride. "How did it go?" she asked. Elijah smiled, pulling her into a hug. "We're making progress," he said, "one step at a time." And with that, he knew he was ready to keep fighting. For them, for his community, and for a future where dignity truly came first. The legacy of change. The early morning sunlight streamed through the window of Elijah Thompson's home office, casting long shadows across his desk. Papers, sticky notes, and a laptop cluttered the surface, each representing a part of his growing movement. Elijah sipped his coffee, his gaze focused on the list of upcoming events and initiatives for the Dignity First campaign. He was tired but energized, a strange juxtaposition that had become familiar over the past year. He leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to how far things had come. What had started as a deeply personal moment of humiliation had grown into a nationwide movement for justice and accountability. Policies had been rewritten, leaders had been held accountable, and the voices of the marginalized were finally being heard. Yet Elijah knew there was still much to do. The documentary. One of the most impactful developments in the campaign was the production of a documentary titled Dignity First, A Soldier's Fight for Justice. A renowned filmmaker had approached Elijah months earlier, wanting to chronicle his journey and the broader issues of systemic injustice. After much deliberation, Elijah agreed, seeing it as another way to reach people who might otherwise remain unaware or indifferent. The filming process was both exhausting and cathartic. Cameras followed Elijah to meetings, protests, and even intimate moments at home with his family. They captured his speeches at rallies, the tense negotiations with policymakers, and his quiet reflections during late-night drives. One particularly emotional scene involved Elijah visiting the airport where it all began. He walked through the security checkpoint, his heart pounding as memories of that day resurfaced. He paused in the same spot where Officer Harris had shoved him against the table, the pain of that moment still palpable. The filmmaker asked, "What's going through your mind right now?" Elijah looked directly into the camera, his voice steady but raw. "I think about how many people pass through this airport every day, carrying their own battles, their own pain. What happened to me isn't unique, and that's what makes it so heartbreaking. But it's also what drives me. If we can make this place safer, fairer, and more humane, then this fight is worth it." A monumental win. 6 months later, the documentary premiered at a major film festival, receiving critical acclaim and sparking widespread public dialogue. It was picked up by a streaming platform, reaching millions of viewers across the globe. The impact was immediate. Donations to the Dignity First campaign surged, and lawmakers who had previously ignored Elijah's calls for action began reaching out. One of the most significant victories came shortly after the documentary's release. Congress passed the Dignity and Accountability Act, a sweeping piece of legislation aimed at reforming security protocols nationwide. The act included mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight committees, and strict consequences for misconduct. Elijah was invited to the White House for the signing ceremony. As he stood in the Rose Garden, watching the president sign the bill into law, he felt a mix of pride and humility. He hadn't started this journey seeking fame or accolades. He had simply wanted to stand up for what was right. And now, that stand had turned into something far greater. Confronting the past. Despite the progress, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unresolved pieces of his story. One day, he received a letter from Officer Harris. It was unexpected, and for a moment, Elijah debated whether to even open it. But curiosity won out. The letter was handwritten, the penmanship shaky but earnest. Harris expressed deep regret for his actions, admitting that his behavior had been driven by personal biases and unchecked anger. He shared that he had sought therapy and was participating in community programs to address his prejudices. The letter ended with a request to meet in person. Elijah folded the letter and sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to leave the past where it belonged. But another part of him, the part that had pushed for dialogue and reconciliation from the beginning, knew what he had to do. The meeting. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe, far from the media spotlight. Elijah arrived early, unsure of what to expect. When Harris walked in, he looked different, older, more subdued. He approached the table hesitantly, his hands trembling slightly as he extended them for a handshake. "Corporal Thompson," Harris began, his voice low. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Elijah nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Let's talk." The conversation was tense at first, both men struggling to navigate the weight of their shared history. Harris spoke about his upbringing, the environment that had shaped his views, and the long process of unlearning the biases he had carried for so long. He didn't excuse his actions, but he provided context that helped Elijah see him as a flawed human being rather than a one-dimensional villain. "I don't expect forgiveness," Harris said, his voice cracking. "But I want to be part of the solution. I want to help make sure no one else goes through what I put you through." Elijah studied him for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he said finally, "but accountability is a step toward it. If you're serious about change, then prove it, not to me, but to the people you serve." Harris nodded, visibly moved. "I will." A legacy of hope. Years later, Elijah stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd of young activists and leaders. The Dignity First campaign had grown into a global movement, with chapters in dozens of countries and partnerships with major organizations. Elijah, now a seasoned advocate, reflected on the journey that had brought him here. "This fight isn't about one person or one moment," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about all of us. It's about the dignity we owe each other as human beings. It's about standing up, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable, because change doesn't come from silence. It comes from action." As the crowd erupted into applause, Elijah spotted Natalie and their daughters in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. Ava, now a teenager, had started her own social justice club at school, while Leela was already asking to attend her first rally. They were his greatest motivators, the reason he had embarked on this journey and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. Elijah knew the fight for justice was never truly over, but as he looked out at the sea of inspired faces, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. What had started as one man's struggle had become a collective movement, proving that even in the face of injustice, hope and resilience could prevail. And with that, Elijah Thompson, soldier, advocate, and father, stepped off the stage, ready for whatever came next.